Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I used to think the desert was silent, lifeless, and unchanging. I couldn't have been more wrong. Sitting here now, in this tiny motel room on the edge of nowhere, the faint buzzing of the fluorescent light overhead does nothing to mask the lingering dread that coils around my chest like a snake. The desert isn't silent, it whispers, things you can't unhear, and it watches. The night it all began, I was halfway through a solo road trip, chasing the kind of freedom only empty highways can provide. My name is Eric, I'm 29, and I live in Phoenix, Arizona. This trip was supposed to be my escape, my reset button. The plan was simple: drive across the Southwest, camp under the stars, and let the vastness of the landscape clear my mind. Instead, it left me with memories I'll never be able to shake, and questions I hope I never find answers to. I had been driving for hours, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and blood red. The nearest town was still 2 hours away, but I was too tired to push on. Spotting an unmarked dirt road, I decided to pull over and set up camp. The road led to a small clearing surrounded by jagged rocks and sparse, spindly bushes that looked like skeletons frozen mid-dance. It was the perfect kind of isolation, or so I thought. The first sign that something was off came just after nightfall. I had finished dinner, a can of beans heated over a small fire, and was lying back on my sleeping bag, staring at the stars. The desert night was still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the brush. Then I heard it, a faint clicking sound, like someone tapping two stones together. It came from somewhere beyond the firelight. I sat up, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called, my voice thin against the vast emptiness. No response. Just more clicking, a steady rhythm that seemed to circle the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but rocks and shadows. The sound stopped. My heart thudded against my ribs as I slowly backed toward the fire, my every instinct screaming that I was not alone. An hour passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The fire crackled weakly, its light casting flickering shadows on the surrounding rocks. I was debating whether to pack up and leave when I saw it, movement at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a flash of pale, elongated limbs darting between the rocks. My stomach dropped. I turned the flashlight back on and aimed it at the spot, but whatever I had seen was gone. And then, the clicking returned. It was louder this time, sharper, as if it were right behind me. Spinning around, I aimed the flashlight wildly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The beam landed on a figure, a thing, standing just beyond the firelight. It was humanoid, but impossibly thin, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the dark. Its head was elongated, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight like black mirrors. Its mouth was open, revealing teeth that were jagged and far too many. It didn't move, but its head tilted slightly, as if curious. My body froze, every muscle locked in place. The thing stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then, without warning, it let out a guttural, chittering sound that made my skin crawl. I scrambled backward, tripping over my sleeping bag and landing hard on the ground. By the time I looked up again, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every rustle, every whisper of wind felt like a threat. When dawn finally broke, I packed up camp in record time and drove until the desert began to blur outside my window. I told myself I had imagined it, that exhaustion and isolation had played tricks on my mind, but deep down, I knew better. The second encounter happened 2 days later. I had checked into a small motel just outside Joshua Tree, hoping the comfort of 4 walls would help me feel safe. The room was shabby but clean, with a faded floral bedspread and a window that looked out over the vast expanse of desert. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The clicking. It was faint, muffled by the walls, but unmistakable. My chest tightened as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from just outside the window. I wanted to look, to prove to myself that nothing was there, but fear rooted me in place. The clicking stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate scratching against the glass. My breath hitched. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I forced myself to turn my head toward the window. At first, all I saw was my own reflection in the glass, pale and wide-eyed. Then the reflection shifted, and I realized with horror that something was standing on the other side. The creature's face was pressed against the window, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Its eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as if I were staring into something that shouldn't exist. The scratching grew more frantic, and I bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the motel's main office, where the elderly manager sat dozing behind the counter. When I tried to explain what had happened, he just stared at me like I was crazy. "You shouldn't have stopped in the desert," he said finally, his voice low. "Things out there don't like to be seen." I left the motel at first light, my nerves frayed and my body running on adrenaline. I told myself I was heading home, that I'd put the desert behind me and never look back. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The final encounter came on an empty stretch of highway, miles from anywhere. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. My car's engine hummed steadily, the only sound in the oppressive silence. And then, the clicking returned. This time, it was inside the car. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sound was coming from the back seat, rhythmic and deliberate. I didn't want to look, but some primal instinct forced my eyes to the rearview mirror. It was there, sitting in the back seat, its gaunt frame folded unnaturally to fit. Its mouth moved, producing that horrible clicking sound, and its eyes locked onto mine through the mirror. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. Whipping around, I found the back seat empty. Heart pounding, I fumbled with the door handle and stumbled out onto the road. The desert stretched out around me, vast and indifferent, and for a moment I wondered if I was losing my mind. Then I saw them. Dozens of figures stood in the distance, pale and motionless, their black eyes fixed on me. The clicking sound rose in unison, a symphony of dread that filled the air. I backed away, my legs shaking, and climbed back into the car. Flooring the gas pedal, I sped away, the figures growing smaller in my rearview mirror until they vanished entirely. I made it home the next day, but I haven't been the same since. The desert took something from me, my peace, my sense of safety, and left me with a fear I can't explain. At night, I still hear the clicking, faint and distant, as if the beings are reminding me that they're still out there, waiting, watching. And I know one thing for certain, I'll never go back. I never believed in ghosts or curses. Those were things for superstitious people, or so I thought. But now as I write this, my hands are trembling, and my heart is pounding in a way that no amount of rationality can explain. It started with a doll, an ordinary dusty porcelain doll. At least that's what I told myself when I first saw it. My name is Mark Hansen. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an antique dealer in Portland, Oregon. My job is simple. Find rare items, clean them up, and sell them to collectors. Most of the time, my work is more boring than glamorous. Endless garage sales and estate auctions. But last month, I stumbled on something that changed my life forever. It was at an estate sale in the outskirts of Salem. The house was enormous, decayed, and crammed with items that reeked of mildew and neglect. I'd spent hours sorting through old furniture, faded paintings, and chipped ceramics when I found it. Her. She was sitting in a corner, partially hidden under a moth-eaten blanket. The doll's porcelain face was pale, with glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow me as I approached. Her lips were painted a faint pink, frozen in a soft smile, and her hair was an unnaturally vibrant red, falling in tight ringlets around her face. Her dress was Victorian style, yellowed lace with small embroidered roses. It looked handcrafted. I could tell this was a valuable find. Dolls like this could fetch thousands if they were in good condition. I decided to take her home and clean her up. That night, I put the doll on the workbench in my garage. As I inspected her more closely, I noticed something odd. Scratched faintly into the back of her porcelain neck were 3 words. Don't let her. Don't let her what? The phrase unsettled me, but I brushed it off as some cruel prank from whoever had owned her before. I turned off the light and went back inside, leaving her in the garage. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those glassy eyes. That frozen smile. It felt like she was watching me even though I'd left her out in the garage. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me because I woke up to the sound of a loud thud. I shot upright, heart racing. It was coming from the garage. When I opened the door to the garage, I froze. The doll wasn't on the workbench. She was lying face down in the middle of the concrete floor. The air felt thick, heavy. I told myself she must have fallen, though I couldn't explain how. The bench was sturdy, and the doll had been perfectly balanced. Still, I picked her up, brushed off the dust, and put her back. But as I turned to leave, I swear I heard a faint sound. A whisper so soft it could have been my imagination. It sounded like a child's voice, humming a nursery rhyme. I didn't look back. The next few days were a blur of small, strange occurrences. Items in my house seemed to move when I wasn't looking. A book left open on the counter, a chair slightly out of place. The doll, however, was always exactly where I left her. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was overworked or stressed. But then, on the 3rd night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I reached for my phone, but the screen wouldn't light up. Dead battery. My heart pounded as I crept to the door, holding my breath. I opened it just a crack and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. But when I turned back toward my bed, she was there. The doll. Sitting upright on my pillow, her head tilted slightly to the side as if she were curious. I screamed and threw her across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening crack, but instead of shattering, she landed on the floor with a soft thud. I turned on every light in the house, grabbed the doll, and stuffed her into a box. Then, I locked the box in the trunk of my car. I decided I'd get rid of her in the morning, but the nightmare wasn't over. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was in a dark, endless hallway. The only sound was the faint tap-tap of tiny feet behind me. When I turned around, she was there, standing on her own, her glass eyes locked on mine. She raised one porcelain hand and pointed at me. "You shouldn't have taken me," she whispered. I woke up drenched in sweat, the echo of her voice still ringing in my ears. I ran to the car to make sure she was still locked in the trunk. She was. The box hadn't moved. Relieved, I drove to the edge of town, to a secluded wooded area. I buried the box as deep as I could and covered it with heavy rocks. For a moment, I thought it was over. But 2 nights later, she was back. I found her sitting on my kitchen counter, her dress immaculate, her hair perfectly arranged. My blood ran cold. There was no way she could have been here. I had buried her miles away. I called a friend, Peter, who was more open to the paranormal than I was. When he arrived, I showed him the doll and told him everything. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, His face went pale. "You need to get rid of her," he said. "Not bury her. Burn her." That evening, Peter and I built a fire pit in my backyard. As the flames roared to life, I held the doll in my hands. For the first time, I felt a strange resistance, as if the air around her had thickened. Her glass eyes seemed more alive than ever. When I threw her into the fire, the flames hissed and sputtered. Black smoke curled into the air, and for a moment, I thought I heard screaming. The kind of scream that pierces through your soul. The fire burned out quickly, unnaturally fast. When it was over, there was nothing left of the doll, not even ash. I thought it was over. For weeks, nothing happened. No whispers, no footsteps, no nightmares. I started to believe she was gone for good, until last night. I came home late, exhausted from a long day. As I stepped into my living room, I froze. She was there, sitting in the middle of the coffee table. Her glass eyes locked on mine, and her lips were no longer frozen in a smile. They were moving. "I told you," she said, her voice a soft, menacing whisper. "Don't let me." And then the lights went out. I don't know how I'm writing this. My phone battery is draining fast, and every shadow feels alive. I can hear her humming again, closer this time. If you find this, know that I tried everything. Don't take her. Don't let her. And whatever you do, don't let her in. I've never been a superstitious person. Ghosts, demons, and whatever else goes bump in the night never really scared me. At least that's what I told myself. But something happens when you wake up in the dead of night and realize you're not alone. That's when bravado melts away and you're left with nothing but raw, primal fear. This isn't one of those stories where I can explain everything at the end, tie it all up in a neat little bow, and walk away with closure. No, this is the kind of story that leaves you with more questions than answers, and sleepless nights. It all started when I moved into the apartment. The place was small but affordable, tucked into a quiet corner of town. The landlord was eager to rent it out, which should have been my first red flag. He barely let me finish signing the lease before he shoved the keys into my hand and practically bolted. The first few nights were uneventful. I worked late at the office, came home, watched TV, and went to bed. The building was old, with creaky floors and thin walls, but I didn't mind. I told myself it had character. Then, on the fourth night, it happened. I woke up at exactly 3:14 a.m. I remember the time because the glow from my alarm clock seemed unnaturally bright in the darkness. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. That's when I saw it. In the corner of my bedroom, near the foot of my bed, was a shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Maybe the street lamp outside casting a weird angle through the blinds. But this shadow didn't behave like a shadow should. It was too solid, too defined, and it didn't waver or shift when I blinked. It was watching me. I couldn't see eyes, but I could feel them cold and unblinking, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My mouth went dry, and for a long moment I couldn't move. I don't know how long I stared at it. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like forever. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, it moved. It didn't lunge or attack. It simply slid closer, the way oil spreads on water. Smooth, deliberate, and unnerving. That was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I fumbled for the lamp on my bedside table, my hand shaking so badly I nearly knocked it over. When I finally managed to switch it on, the room flooded with warm yellow light. The shadow was gone. I told myself it was just a nightmare, even though I'd been wide awake. I forced myself to laugh it off, even as I double-checked every corner of the apartment. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The following nights were worse. The shadow returned, always at the same time, always watching. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was nothing, but it became harder and harder to pretend. Some nights, it stayed in the corner. Other nights, it crept closer. Once, I woke to find it hovering right next to my bed, so close I could feel the air around it, cold and heavy, like standing in front of an open freezer. By the second week, I was a wreck. I stopped sleeping, too afraid of what I might see if I closed my eyes. I left the lights on, but it didn't help. The shadow didn't care about light. It appeared regardless, growing bolder and more solid with each passing night. I started hearing whispers too. They were faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone speaking from the other side of a wall. I couldn't make out the words, but they were urgent, insistent, and they filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Desperate, I tried to figure out what was happening. I scoured the internet, looking for stories about hauntings or shadow people. Most of what I found was useless. Amateur ghost hunters and creepy pasta stories that felt too far removed from my reality. But one thread caught my eye. A user described a shadow figure similar to mine, one that appeared at night and seemed to feed off fear. The post was short, just a few lines, but it ended with a chilling warning. Whatever you do, don't let it touch you. If it touches you, it's too late. I slammed my laptop shut and turned on every light in the apartment. For the rest of the night, I sat in my kitchen, clutching a knife and praying for morning. By the third week, I was unraveling. My boss noticed my exhaustion and sent me home early, but I didn't want to be in that apartment. I started spending my evenings at coffee shops, staying out as late as possible. But I couldn't avoid sleep forever. One night I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, it was 3:14 a.m. The shadow was there, standing at the foot of the couch, taller and darker than ever. This time, it didn't just watch. It reached out, a tendril of darkness extending toward me like smoke curling through the air. I scrambled back, knocking over a lamp in my panic, but it was too fast. The shadow touched my arm, and the instant it did, a searing pain shot through me like I'd been burned. I screamed and thrashed, and suddenly the shadow was gone. But the pain remained, along with a dark, bruise-like mark on my skin that no amount of scrubbing could erase. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I packed a bag and left, checking into a cheap motel on the other side of town. For a while, I thought I was safe. The first few nights were quiet, and I started to believe I'd escaped. But then, on the fifth night, I woke up to find the shadow standing at the foot of the motel bed. It had followed me. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me. I've moved 3 times since then, but it doesn't matter. No matter where I go, it finds me. The shadow doesn't just watch anymore, it whispers to me, words I still can't understand. But I know they're meant for me. And now, it's closer than ever. As I write this, it's standing in the corner of my room, watching. I can feel its cold presence pressing against me, wrapping around me like a shroud. The mark on my arm has spread, dark veins spidering out from the original bruise. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. If you're reading this, and you've ever woken up to a shadow that doesn't belong, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it or explain it away. And whatever you do, don't let it touch you. Because once it does, it's already too late. I first heard the crying on a damp Thursday night. At first, I thought it was the wind, wailing as it whipped through the narrow alleys of my tiny coastal town. But then it came again, closer this time, unmistakably human. A mournful, gut-wrenching sobbing that sent a chill crawling up my spine. "Who's out there?" I muttered under my breath, pulling the curtains aside to peer into the shadowy street below. My apartment overlooked the town square, usually quiet this late at night. The street lamps cast weak, flickering pools of light onto the cobblestones, but I saw no one. The sobbing grew louder, seeming to echo in my very skull. It was so close now, like it was coming from the walls of my apartment itself. I told myself it was just the fatigue. I'd been pulling double shifts at the marina lately, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I closed the curtains and returned to the couch, the flickering TV offering some solace. But then I heard it again, a long, broken wail, as if whoever was crying had just lost everything. My heart was pounding. For as long as I could remember, there'd been stories about a woman crying near the cliffs outside town. Locals called her La Plorona, a variation of the Mexican legend of La Llorona, but the stories here were darker. They said she was a ghost who lured people to their deaths at the jagged rocks below. I'd always thought the stories were just that, myths spun to keep curious kids away from the cliffs. But now, the sound was so real, so raw. I grabbed a flashlight and my jacket. I don't know what compelled me to investigate. Maybe it was the restless curiosity that had always gotten me into trouble. Or maybe it was the eerie magnetism of the sound, drawing me like a moth to flame. Stepping outside, the night air hit me like a wall, salty and cold. The crying continued, faint now but persistent, leading me down the cobblestone streets and toward the cliffs. The flashlight beam bounced along the uneven ground as I walked, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound accompanying the sobs. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The crying stopped. I froze, my breath visible in the frosty air. "Who's there?" I asked, louder this time. No response. I took a step forward, and then another, the flashlight sweeping the rocky terrain. And then, just as I reached the edge of the cliffs, I saw her. She was kneeling by the edge, her back to me, her long black hair hanging in matted strands over her pale shoulders. Her dress, once white, was dirty and torn, fluttering in the icy breeze. "Ma'am?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't turn around. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Slowly, so painfully slowly, she began to rise. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, as though she were a puppet being dragged to its feet by invisible strings. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. She turned. Her face, or what should have been her face, was a grotesque void, smooth and featureless like polished stone. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Yet somehow, the crying started again, emanating from her, loud and echoing and wrong. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My voice caught in my throat as I tried to scream. The figure began to move toward me, gliding rather than walking, her head tilted as if studying me. I turned and ran. I burst into my apartment and locked the door, my heart racing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the deadbolt. For hours I sat on the floor in silence, clutching the flashlight like it was a lifeline. The sobbing had stopped, but I could still hear it in my mind, a phantom echo that refused to fade. When morning came, I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But the unease lingered. Over the next few days, the crying returned. Always at night, always outside my window. I stopped sleeping, stopped leaving the apartment. My co-workers at the marina called to check on me, but I ignored them. The crying wasn't just outside anymore, it was in my apartment, coming from the bathroom, the closet, the walls. And it wasn't just her sobs now. There were whispers, low and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. I returned to the cliffs, flashlight and a crowbar in hand this time. The wind was fiercer tonight, howling like a banshee as I approached the edge. "Show yourself!" I shouted into the void. "What do you want from me?" The crying began immediately, louder than ever, surrounding me, suffocating me. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but the beam only caught glimpses of the shadows. And then she appeared. She was closer this time, her head cocked unnaturally to one side, her faceless visage seeming to pierce straight through me. "Why me?" I whispered. Her hand shot out, bony fingers impossibly long and pale, and touched my chest. The world went dark. I woke up in my apartment, drenched in sweat. For a moment I thought it was all a nightmare, but the dirt under my fingernails and the torn fabric of my jacket said otherwise. I wasn't alone. The sobbing was in the corner of the room, low and menacing. I didn't dare look. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The crying stopped. I didn't mean to hurt her. The voice was inside my head, a whisper that felt like a scream. "Hurt who?" I asked. The air grew colder, the room darker, and then I remembered. When I was a kid, a girl from my class went missing. Emily. Sweet, shy Emily. She used to sit by the cliffs and draw in her little sketchbook. I'd always teased her for it, called her names, thrown rocks to scare her off. One day, she didn't come back from the cliffs. They never found her body. "You pushed her," the voice said, and I gasped. No, I didn't mean to. It was an accident," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean for her to fall." The crying began again, louder than ever, deafening. "You never told." The flashlight in my hand flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "You'll pay." The last thing I saw was her faceless head leaning toward me. When they found my apartment, the walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges like someone had clawed at them in desperation. There was no sign of me except for a single footprint in the dust near the window, leading to the cliffs. I shouldn't be here. I knew at the moment my foot sank into the soft, rotting earth of that desolate forest clearing. It wasn't just the silence, an unnatural void where birds should have chirped and wind should have whispered. It was the weight, the oppressive heaviness pressing down on my chest as if the ground itself wanted me gone. My name is Ethan Hart, and I've always had an affinity for exploration. I grew up in Colorado, surrounded by sprawling mountains and dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. By the time I turned 30, I'd hiked nearly every notable trail in the state. But in hindsight, I wish I'd stuck to the paths laid out for tourists. I wish I'd never ventured into the cursed lands of Pine Hollow. Pine Hollow isn't marked on any maps, and for good reason. It's the kind of place locals warn you about with vague, ominous remarks. The stories range from whispers of ghostly apparitions to entire families vanishing without a trace. Despite its infamy, I had never taken those tales seriously. I assumed the rumors were simply the byproduct of a collective imagination. After all, every town has its haunted spots, right? It was late October when I first heard about the old cabin in Pine Hollow. My friend and fellow adventurer, Jake, stumbled across an article detailing the mysterious disappearance of an entire forestry team there in the 1940s. According to the report, the cabin was their base camp, but when another team came to relieve them weeks later, they found the cabin abandoned with all the supplies untouched. No bodies were ever found. Jake, always the thrill seeker, suggested we check it out. I hesitated. Something about this one felt different, but my curiosity got the better of me. The next Saturday, we packed our gear, loaded up on supplies, and set out for the uncharted territory of Pine Hollow. The hike was grueling. Thick, tangled underbrush clawed at our legs, and the further we ventured, the darker it became, as if the sunlight itself refused to touch the cursed land. Jake joked to lighten the mood, but even he seemed on edge. When we finally reached the clearing, the sight of the cabin sent a chill down my spine. It was decrepit, leaning at an unnatural angle, as if the earth beneath it was trying to swallow it whole. The wooden planks were warped and gray, and the windows were covered in grime so thick you couldn't see inside. Jake grinned. "You ready for some ghost hunting?" I forced a laugh and followed him inside. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The furniture was sparse, a rickety table, a few chairs, and a dusty cot shoved against the wall. Oddly enough, the cabin seemed untouched by time. A kettle still sat on the stove, a rusted lantern hung by the door, and a pair of boots lay neatly by the cot. It was as if whoever had lived here had simply vanished mid-step. As we explored, I noticed something odd: carvings on the walls. They weren't random scratches or initials left by careless hikers. They were symbols, crude, intricate, and deeply unsettling. One caught my attention, a spiraling shape with jagged edges, like a vortex pulling everything into darkness. "What do you think these mean?" I asked Jake. He shrugged, snapping photos with his phone. Probably some bored kids trying to freak people out. But I wasn't so sure. That night, we decided to camp near the cabin. Jake set up the tent while I gathered firewood. By the time darkness fell, the oppressive silence had returned, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The fire crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the cabin's weathered walls. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, circling the tent. My heart raced as I strained to listen. "Jake," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he groaned. "Do you hear that?" He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, we both sat in silence, waiting. Then, from the direction of the cabin, we heard it, a low, guttural growl. Jake grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. "Probably just a coyote," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The beam of light swept across the clearing, but there was nothing there. No animals, no movement. Just the cabin looming like a dark sentinel. "We should check it out," Jake said. I hesitated. "Maybe we should leave." Jake smirked. "Scared already? Come on, man. It's just an old cabin." Against my better judgment, I followed him. Inside, the cabin felt different. The air was colder, and the carvings on the walls seemed to shimmer in the weak light of Jake's flashlight. As we moved deeper inside, a strange sensation washed over me, a tingling at the back of my neck, as if we were being watched. Jake stopped abruptly, shining the light on the far wall. My stomach dropped. The symbols had changed. The spiraling vortex now stretched across the entire wall, and the jagged edges seemed sharper, more menacing. Did you see this earlier?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Jake cursed, fumbling with the batteries, but then we heard it again, the growling. Only this time, it was inside the cabin. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice cracking. The growling grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the floorboards. My chest tightened as a shadow began to take shape in the corner. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing Jake's arm. We bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The growling turned into a deafening roar, and I felt a force slam into me, knocking the air from my lungs. The next thing I remember, I was lying in the clearing, gasping for breath. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the forest. Jake was beside me, his face pale, and his eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" I whispered. He shook his head. I don't know. One minute we were in the cabin, and the next, we didn't say much as we packed up and left Pine Hollow. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken fear. When we finally made it back to civilization, I tried to forget what happened. I told myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew better. A week later, Jake called me in a panic. He said he'd been having nightmares, vivid and horrifying. He saw the shadowy figure every night, its red eyes burning into his soul. Then he stopped answering his phone altogether. When I went to his apartment, it was empty. The landlord said he'd moved out without a word. I never saw Jake again. Now, years later, I still feel the weight of that cursed land. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sound of growling echoing in my ears. and sometimes in the corner of my room, I see it, the shadow with red eyes, watching, waiting. If you ever find yourself near Pine Hollow, do yourself a favor, turn around. Don't let curiosity pull you into its grasp, because once you step onto cursed land, it never lets you go. I've always been the type to take shortcuts. My name's Luke Carter, I'm 31, and I make a living as a freelance photographer. Deadlines rule my life. And when you're chasing a sunset for the perfect shot, every second counts. That's how I first heard about Willow's End Road. It wasn't just a shortcut, it shaved off nearly 40 minutes from the winding highways outside Shady Pines. But every local I asked had the same reaction. Don't drive down that road. People don't come back the same, an old gas station attendant muttered, eyes darting away from mine like he was afraid to even think about it too hard. I laughed it off. Ghost stories and local legends were just that, stories. But when a gig landed me photographing an abandoned railway depot deep in the forest, and time was slipping away, I couldn't resist. The moment I turned onto Willow's End Road, I understood why people avoided it. The pavement was cracked and uneven, overgrown with weeds that clawed at my car tires. Dense, towering pines flanked both sides, their gnarled branches stretching across the sky like skeletal fingers. My headlights barely penetrated the suffocating darkness ahead, and the air, it felt heavy. I brushed off the creeping unease. "It's just a road," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. 10 minutes in, the static began. At first, I thought it was interference from my old car radio, but the volume dial was off. The faint hissing and crackling filled the silence, growing louder as I drove. Then came the whispers, faint, indistinct, like a dozen voices murmuring just beyond hearing. I rolled down the windows, expecting to hear wind or insects, but the forest outside was eerily silent. Not even the crunch of gravel or the hum of my engine seemed to echo back at me. The whispers grew sharper, more distinct. "Turn around. Leave. Don't look back." Every hair on my neck stood on end. I glanced at my rearview mirror, my heart pounding, expecting to see something. Anything. But there was only the black void of the road behind me. I sped up. The deeper I drove, the stranger things became. My headlights flickered, the beams casting fleeting shadows that danced unnaturally. Shapes darted at the edges of my vision. Tall, humanoid figures too thin to be people, their movements jerky like old marionettes. And the air, it grew colder. I could see my breath fogging the windshield even though it was midsummer. Then, my car jerked violently to the left, as if something had struck it. "Jesus!" I shouted, slamming the brakes. The car screeched to a stop, skidding slightly on the uneven road. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled for my flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was darker than I'd ever seen. The flashlight beam barely reached more than a few feet, swallowed by the oppressive black. I crouched by the driver's side, scanning the tires. Nothing. No damage. But when I stood, I saw them. Handprints. Pale, skeletal, and smeared across the driver's side door like something had clawed at the car. A low growl rumbled from the trees. It wasn't an animal. The sound was wrong. A wet, guttural noise that reverberated in my chest. I backed away, flashlight trembling in my grip. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The growling stopped, replaced by a sickening, wet squelch. Then came the laughter, high-pitched, childlike giggles that echoed from every direction. I scrambled back into the car, locking the doors and gunning the engine. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, propelling me forward. The laughter didn't fade. It followed, growing louder, closer. I don't know how long I drove, but the road seemed endless, looping back on itself like some cruel joke. The forest closed in tighter, the trees leaning impossibly close to the car, their twisted branches scraping against the roof like nails on a chalkboard. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Why didn't you leave?" "Now it's too late." look in the mirror. I didn't want to. My hands trembled on the wheel, my knuckles white, but I couldn't resist. I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. A figure sat in the back seat. Its face was a void, blacker than the surrounding night, but its eyes, they burned a sickly yellow, unblinking and searing into mine. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. When I turned around, the back seat was empty. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, the air thick and suffocating. I knew I couldn't stay here, but every instinct screamed that going forward was a mistake. Yet when I checked the road behind me, it was gone. The trees had closed in, leaving no way back. I don't remember making the decision to drive. It was as if the car moved on its own. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but something was wrong. The pavement shimmered, shifting like liquid, and shapes emerged from it. People. They staggered into the road, their forms translucent, their faces contorted in agony. Some reached out toward the car, their mouths opening in silent screams, while others crawled, dragging broken limbs behind them. I swerved, narrowly avoiding them, but they kept coming, pouring from the trees, from the cracks in the pavement. A woman appeared directly in front of me. Her dress was torn and stained, her hair a matted tangle. Her eyes were wide and hollow, her jaw unhinged as she let out an ear-piercing scream that shattered the windshield. I veered off the road. The car plunged into the ditch, slamming into something solid. Pain shot through my chest as the seatbelt dug into my ribs. Everything went dark. When I came to, the car was dead, and the forest was silent once more. I stumbled out, clutching my flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. The road was gone. I was surrounded by trees, their trunks impossibly wide, their bark pulsating like living flesh. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. I turned in circles, desperate to find a way out, when I saw it. The figure from my car. It stood just beyond the reach of the flashlight, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. Slowly, it raised an arm, pointing toward something behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Cold breath brushed against my neck. I spun, and there it was. A massive, writhing mass of shadow and flesh, its form constantly shifting, mouths and eyes appearing and disappearing across its surface. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping, drowning out my thoughts. It surged toward me. I don't remember escaping. When I woke, I was lying on the side of the highway, my car nowhere to be seen. The sun was rising, casting warm light across the empty road. A trucker pulled over, his face pale when he saw me. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "Nobody comes back from Willow's End." I didn't correct him. I've tried to forget that night, but some scars run deeper than memory. Sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I catch glimpses of figures in the rearview mirror, their yellow eyes glowing in the dark. And I can still hear the whispers. They're always there, waiting. The ocean had always been my refuge, a place where the noise of the world faded into the rhythmic lull of waves. But now, as I sit here, staring at the empty shoreline, the sound of the sea feels more like a warning than a comfort. I've spent the last month trying to forget what I saw, or rather, what I survived. But some things don't let you go, and what waits in the water is one of them. My name is Ethan Harris. I'm 34 years old, and I grew up on the coast of Maine, in a small fishing town called Ashport. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the sea is both a lifeline and a graveyard. When I was younger, we told ghost stories about the things lurking in the waves, but none of us ever believed them. That was before I took a job on the Marigold, a fishing trawler with a reputation for pushing boundaries. It was mid-October when the captain, a wiry, sharp-eyed man named Jack, decided to take the boat farther out than usual. The haul closer to shore had been thin, and desperation was creeping into his voice. "Ethan, you're not scared of a little adventure, are you?" he asked with a crooked grin. I should have said no. The journey started normally enough. The crew was in good spirits. The weather was cool but calm, and the boat cut through the waves with an almost arrogant ease. But by the third day, something felt off. The water had taken on a strange quality, darker and heavier, as though it was hiding something beneath the surface. That night, while the others slept, I stood on the deck, staring at the moonlit expanse of water. It was then I heard it, the singing. At first, it was faint, a melody carried by the wind, so delicate I thought I imagined it. But as I leaned over the railing, it grew louder, clearer, more haunting. It was a woman's voice, achingly beautiful, weaving a song that seemed to seep into my bones. My heart raced, but I couldn't look away from the water. A shadow moved beneath the surface. I stumbled back, suddenly gripped by a cold, irrational fear. The singing stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the slap of waves against the hull. Then, I heard something even more chilling. A splash, followed by the creak of the ladder at the side of the boat. Someone was climbing aboard. I froze, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe one of the crew had fallen overboard and was climbing back up. But when I turned, the figure emerging from the water was not one of us. She was stunning, her long black hair clinging to her pale skin, her eyes reflecting the moonlight like mirrors. But there was something wrong, something too sharp about her teeth when she smiled, something too fluid about the way she moved. Her gaze locked onto mine, and I felt an inexplicable pull, like she was reaching into my chest and gripping my heart. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice like silk. I don't remember telling her my name. My legs refused to move as she stepped closer, leaving a trail of water on the deck. "You've been calling me," she whispered. "I heard you. I didn't call anyone," I stammered, finally finding my voice. Her smile widened. "Oh, but you did. The sea listens, Ethan. It always listens." Before I could respond, her hand shot out and grabbed my arm. Her grip was ice cold, and her nails dug into my skin like claws. I yanked back, but she was impossibly strong. Her eyes flicked to the water below, and I knew. She was going to drag me under. A shout broke the spell. "Ethan, get back!" It was Jack. He came barreling toward us, swinging a boat hook like a weapon. The woman, no, the creature, hissed, her face twisting into something inhuman. She let go of me and leapt over the railing with an eerie, unnatural grace. Jack grabbed my shoulder, shaking me. "What the hell were you doing? Don't you know what that was?" I shook my head, still trembling. What was she?" "A siren," he said grimly. "And if she comes back, we're all dead." The crew was awake now, their faces pale as Jack recounted what had happened. The older members nodded knowingly, muttering about the old legends. According to them, sirens weren't just myths, they were predators, luring sailors to their doom with their voices. "She's marked you," one of them said, pointing at the scratches on my arm. "She won't stop until she gets you." Jack ordered us to head back to shore immediately, but the ocean had other plans. The wind picked up, and the waves grew violent, slamming against the boat with a fury I'd never seen before. It was as if the sea itself was trying to keep us from leaving. And then the singing returned. It was louder this time, echoing over the storm, wrapping around us like a net. The others covered their ears, shouting at me to do the same, but I couldn't. The melody was inside my head now, pulling me toward the edge of the boat. My feet moved on their own, one step at a time, until I was at the railing again. Below, the siren waited. Her face was a mask of serenity, but her eyes burned with a hunger that made my stomach churn. "Ethan," she called, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Come to me." I leaned over the edge, her words drowning out the warnings of the crew. Then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed the back of my jacket and yanked me backward. It was Jack. "Not today," he growled, pulling me away from the siren's gaze. But saving me came at a cost. As Jack pulled me back, the siren's expression turned feral. She screamed, a piercing, unearthly sound that shattered the night. The waves surged, slamming into the boat with enough force to knock us both to the deck. I heard the crack of wood as the hull began to splinter. "We're sinking!" someone yelled. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and cold. The crew scrambled for the lifeboats, but the storm was relentless, tossing us around like toys. I remember the water swallowing me whole, the cold searing my lungs as I fought to stay afloat. I remember the siren's laughter, echoing in my ears even as I drifted into unconsciousness. When I woke up, I was lying on the shore, the wreckage of the Marigold scattered around me. Of the crew, only 3 of us had survived. Jack wasn't one of them. It's been weeks since that night, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of singing, only to find myself standing at the edge of the water, staring into the waves. I don't know why she let me live, but I'm not naive enough to think it's over. The ocean isn't just a place, it's a force, ancient and unforgiving. And somewhere out there, the siren is waiting, her song echoing through the depths, calling for me. Next time I might not be able to resist. I don't sleep anymore. The darkness in my room doesn't feel empty. It feels alive. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the house, it all leads back to the same place. My closet. People scoff when I tell them. "You're just imagining it," they say. But they haven't lived through the suffocating silence, the eerie stillness, or the cold, unrelenting stare from the shadows. It all began 3 months ago. My name is Daniel Harper, and I moved into this old, creaky house in Albany, New York. I'm 27, and this place was supposed to be a fresh start after a nasty breakup and a dead-end job. It was cheap, too cheap for how big it was, and I should have known there was a reason for that. The closet in my bedroom wasn't unusual, at least at first glance. Tall, wooden, with a sliding door that groaned whenever you opened it. I didn't think twice about it. That was my first mistake. The first incident happened on a rainy Tuesday night. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, the sound of raindrops tapping against the window soothing me to sleep. That's when I heard it. A soft thump from the closet. My head snapped toward the noise, my heart suddenly racing. "Just the house settling," I mumbled, trying to reassure myself. But then it happened again. Thump, thump, scrape. It sounded deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving inside. I sat up, the blanket clutched in my fists. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow of my phone. I stared at the closet, unblinking. For what felt like hours, nothing happened. Just silence. I finally convinced myself to get up, turned on the light, and slid the closet door open. Nothing. Just my clothes hanging there, lifeless and still. I shook my head, laughed nervously, and went back to bed. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I swore I felt something watching me. The noises became more frequent after that. Thumps, scratches, whispers that I told myself were just my imagination. One night, the door slid open on its own. I was half asleep, and the whoosh of it jolted me awake. My eyes darted to the closet, my breath caught in my throat. The door was ajar, revealing a sliver of shadowy darkness inside. "Hello?" I whispered, immediately feeling foolish. My voice cracked, and the sound barely carried in the stillness of the room. No response, of course. I didn't sleep at all that night. Then things got worse. It wasn't just sounds anymore. Objects began to move. I'd leave my shoes neatly by the door only to find one of them inside the closet the next morning. A picture frame fell off the wall, the glass shattered, and the photo inside, a picture of me and my younger sister, was gone. I searched everywhere for it, but it was like it had vanished. One night I woke up to the sensation of cold air on my face. My eyes fluttered open and I froze. The closet door was wide open, and in the dark abyss, I swore I saw something move. A flicker of a shadow, tall and hunched. My body refused to move. My chest felt tight, like an invisible weight was pressing down on me. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed, before the first rays of sunlight streamed through my window. The shadow was gone, and the closet looked normal again. But I knew better. I started avoiding my room altogether. I slept on the couch, kept the bedroom door shut, and refused to even glance at the closet when I passed by. My friends told me I was being ridiculous. "Dude, it's probably rats," my buddy Mark said. "Or maybe the wind. You're letting your imagination run wild." But it wasn't the wind. It wasn't rats, and I knew it wasn't my imagination. I decided to set up a camera. If I could capture whatever was happening, maybe I could prove to myself, and everyone else, that I wasn't crazy. I borrowed a motion-activated camera from Mark, set it up in the corner of the room, and aimed it directly at the closet. That night, I forced myself to sleep in the bedroom again, though every nerve in my body screamed against it. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. For hours, there was nothing but me tossing and turning in bed. And then, at 3:27 a.m., the closet door slid open, slowly, agonizingly slow. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the screen. A dark figure stepped out. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. Its body was twisted and gaunt, with impossibly long limbs that moved like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Its face, God, its face was a void. No eyes, no nose, just a gaping black hole where a mouth should have been. It stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, before it turned its head toward the camera. And then the footage cut to static. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I replayed the video, but it was the same every time. The closet door opened. The thing stepped out. It saw the camera. And then, nothing. I didn't go back into the room. I called Mark and begged him to come over. "Bring sage or holy water or something," I said, half joking, half serious. When he arrived, we opened the closet together. It was empty, of course, but the air inside felt different, heavier, colder. Mark laughed nervously. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said, though his voice wavered. We decided to leave the house for a while, grab a drink, and clear our heads. When we returned, the entire bedroom was trashed. Clothes were strewn everywhere, the mattress was flipped, and the closet door was wide open. But the worst part? Written on the walls, in what looked like deep, bloody scratches, were the words, "You can't escape." I haven't gone back since. I'm staying with Mark now, sleeping on his couch and trying to pretend this isn't happening. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Last night, as I lay in the dark, I heard it again. Thump, thump, scrape. This time, it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from under the bed.